Good morning, everybody. Today we are going to look at our laws book, our writing book for the last lesson. It's going to be on complex sentences. This lesson comes out of chapter 5 in your laws book. When I say laws book, I'm talking about your writing book, okay? So this lesson is from chapter 5. We're not going to the beginning of chapter 5, which is about process paragraphs. We're not going to study process paragraphs because we simply don't have time for that. But we do need to study the complex sentences. You will be taking a test on chapter 5 from the book, and many questions on the test have to do with complex sentences. So I'll make sure that you are prepared to take that test, okay? So take your writing book and turn to page 112, 112. Let me share the screen with you. Here we go. Okay, so you're on page 112 of the book, and this is about the complex sentences. Let me take it to the top. Here we go. Okay, 112. Follow along with me. It's probably not real clear on your screen, the book I'm showing you. So it says here on page 112 that in chapters 1 and 2, you learned about simple sentences and compound sentences. And in this chapter, you will learn a third kind of sentence, which is called a complex sentence. So you should remember all this, that with a simple sentence, you have one subject and one verb. Or you could have two subjects and one verb. Or one subject and two verbs. But in a simple sentence, you never have two subjects and two verbs. Those two parts of the sentence connected together with and, or, but, or so. That is a compound sentence, okay? So you should know all this. Today we're going to be looking at complex sentences. Complex sentences have two clauses. That means it has two parts. Both parts of the sentence are called clauses. One is called an independent clause, and one is called a dependent clause. The independent clause is the part of that complete sentence that is a simple sentence in itself, and I'll be showing you examples of that in the book. The dependent clause is the part that is not a sentence in itself. It is dependent. That means it depends on the other part of the sentence for it to make sense, okay? Just like children depend on their parents to raise them properly and in a healthy way. So let's look at this page again. So it tells you here clauses. First, let's learn about clauses. A clause is a group of words that contains at least one subject and one verb, like this. The student arrived late. We have one subject, we have one verb. This makes sense in itself, so this is a complete sentence, but it's still called a clause now because it's part of another sentence. Look at the second one. Because she wasn't feeling well. This sentence also has a subject and a verb, but it is not a simple sentence. It cannot be by itself because of the word because. If we did not have this word and we said she wasn't feeling well, this now would be a complete sentence. It could stand alone. But when we add the word because, it would not make sense for us to just say because she wasn't feeling well, okay? That only makes sense if it is an answer to a question that somebody is asking us in conversation. Somebody can ask, why didn't your friend go to the party? And we could say because she wasn't feeling well. That's a very informal, very casual way of speaking. It's not a complete sentence, but it's okay in a conversation because we know what we're talking about in a conversation. But you cannot do this in writing. These two can go together. The student arrived late because she wasn't feeling well. And in that case, we have what we call a complex sentence, but we're going to talk more about that. Okay. So there are two kinds of clauses in English, independent and dependent. This is what I was talking about before. An independent clause can be a sentence by itself, or two independent clauses can be joined with the conjunctions and, but, or, so, far, yet, or nor. Okay, you did not study for, yet, or nor, but you will next semester in level 3. This semester we just did and, but, or, so. So as you should know by now, if you have two independent clauses together joined by one of these words, that's called a compound sentence. So this is a simple sentence that is also an independent clause because it doesn't need any other words to make sense. The professor provided his email address. We have one subject, we have one verb, and it's a sentence in itself. It makes sense. This is a compound sentence with two independent clauses. That means both parts can be a sentence by themselves. The professor provided his email address is one sentence. Some students did not write it down is another sentence, and is connected by the word but. And you see that there is a comma in front of the word but. This is what we just learned, compound sentence, okay? A dependent clause, in contrast, cannot be a sentence by itself. So the dependent clause are groups of words that cannot be a sentence by itself. It needs other words to go with it. A dependent clause depends on something else to complete its meaning, okay? So that students could send him their compositions, this is not a complete sentence by itself, okay? You notice here, if we took out the words so and that, we would only have students could send him their compositions. That would be a complete sentence. But by putting these words in, now it is no longer a complete sentence by itself. And here's another one. Because they were not paying attention, this is also a dependent clause. It needs more words to make it make sense, all right? So let's talk about the complex sentences. Let me just move this up for you. Okay. A complex sentence is a combination of one independent clause and one or more dependent clauses. For example, the student arrived late because she wasn't feeling well. The two parts of the sentence are the student arrived late. The other part is because she wasn't feeling well. One of these must be an independent clause. One of these must be words that just alone will make a sentence. The student arrived late. We could put a period there, and that would be a simple sentence. That's fine. That's an independent clause. But look at the next part. Because she wasn't feeling well. That cannot be a sentence by itself. Because she wasn't feeling well. We need other words to make this make sense. When we put them together, the student arrived late because she wasn't feeling well. Now we do have a complete sentence, and this is called a complex sentence. It has one independent clause. This particular sentence has one dependent clause, okay? Could have more. Look at the next one. This is an independent clause. The professor gave the class his email address. This could be a sentence by itself. And here's the dependent clause. So that students could send him their compositions. We cannot use this as a sentence by itself. It would not make sense. So that students could send him their compositions needs other words to make sense. And if we put this together, the professor gave the class his email address so that students could send him their compositions. Now it makes sense, okay? And that again is a complex sentence. One independent clause, one dependent clause. This goes on to tell you that usually the independent and dependent clauses in complex sentences can be in any order. However, the punctuation is different depending on the order. So that means that you can, there are two parts, right? Here's one part, here's another part. You could say the student arrived late because she wasn't feeling well, or you can begin with the dependent clause and say because she wasn't feeling well, the student arrived late. The difference is that if you begin with a dependent clause, you must have a comma after the dependent clause. For example, let's look at this. The students had a problem because they did not write down their professor's email address, okay? Two parts of a sentence. The students had a problem. That's the first part. That's the independent part. That's a sentence by itself. The second part, because they did not write down their professor's email address, that is the dependent part of the sentence. This part of the sentence needs this part to make sense. If you take the same words, same sentence, but you begin with the dependent part, which is here, begins with because they did not write down their professor's email address, now you need a comma, the students had a problem. It doesn't matter how you write it. You just need to know, they both mean the same thing. You just need to know that if you begin with the dependent part of the sentence, you must have a comma when that's finished before the independent part of the sentence, okay? Let's go to the next page. This is page 113. And here we have a list of subordinators. Subordinators are the words that you see in complex sentence, and we have a number of them, and they mean different things. So let's read. It tells you that a dependent adverb clause, okay, and you know what, don't even worry about that. I don't want to confuse you. Let's just go with a dependent clause. A dependent clause always begins with a subordinating conjunction or subordinator, okay? So these words here are all what we call subordinators, and you'll see they have different uses. These words are used for time. These words are used for a reason. They answer why. These words are used for a purpose. They answer what for. And these words are used for a condition, okay? So we're going to go over these words in a couple of minutes. Let's just read this. A dependent adverb clause always begins with subordinating conjunction or subordinator. There are different kinds of subordinators. Time subordinators begin a clause that tells when something happens. Reason subordinators begin a clause that tells why something happens. Purpose subordinators begin with a clause that tells the purpose or objective of an event or action or what for. Conditional subordinators begin with a clause that tells the condition under which something can occur, and I'll explain these as we go along. So these words here, these subordinators, as they're called, but they're simply words. These words are called the time subordinators, and they tell when something happens. So you'll see the words like after, as soon as, before, since, until, when, whenever, while. And we'll go through these examples, and you'll see how these words show when something happens. He goes to school after he finishes homework. When does he go to school? After he finishes work. I said homework first, I'm sorry. As, this is probably something new for you. I entered the classroom as the professor was beginning her lecture. When did you enter the classroom? As the professor was beginning her lesson. In this sentence, the word as means when I entered the classroom, the professor was just beginning her lecture, okay? Now you'll see a couple of these words have little asterisks next to them, and that's because they can be used for another reason than just one. In this case, they're used for time, but here you'll see that the word as is also used for reason, but we'll talk about that as we get to it. As soon as, the professor stopped talking as soon as I entered the room. So that means he stopped talking immediately when I entered the room, okay? Before you attend college, you have to fill out an application. Before tells when. Since, and since is one of the words that can also be used down here. Okay, we'll talk about that when we get there. It has been an hour since the test started. This is telling you also when. So the test started an hour ago, okay? Until. We can't leave the room until everyone has finished the test. When can we leave the room? Not until everyone has finished the test. And of course, the word when. When you start college, you sometimes have to take a placement test. Whenever. Whenever I don't sleep well, I feel sick the next day. And the word whenever here and when can be used interchangeably. You can say when I don't sleep well, I feel sick the next day. But whenever means each time. It means every time, okay? It would not make sense to put whenever here. Whenever you start college, you sometimes have to take a placement test. The reason whenever would not go here is because you have the word sometimes. If this word said always, then we can say whenever you start college, you always have to take a placement test. That would be okay. Whenever means every time, each time, okay? The word while. I felt nervous while I was taking my first exam. So at the time that I was taking my first exam, during that time, while I was taking it, I felt nervous. So these words, again, are time subordinators. They tell when, okay? They introduce the dependent clauses of a complex sentence. So here's some others, and two of them we already talked about, as and since. These are reason subordinators. That means that they tell why something happened. So the main reason subordinator is the word because. I did well on my exam because I studied hard. Why did you do well in your exam? Because I studied hard. Because. Look at this as the number of scholarships is limited, it is important to submit your application as soon as possible. Why is it important to submit your application? As the number of scholarships is limited. I want to tell you that you can substitute the word because the number of scholarships is limited is important, etc. Look at the next one, since. Since this is a required course, you must take it. Why must you take it? Since it is a required course. And even here, you could substitute the word because. Because this is a required course, you must take it. So since and as, when used to tell why, when used as reason subordinators, can usually, most of the time, I should say, if not all the time. I'm always afraid to say always with the English language because we have so many exceptions to the rule. But usually you can substitute the word because. They mean the same thing. When you go down here to the purpose subordinator, the purpose means for what reason, and we have so that. So that is the only thing you have to worry about, so that. I studied hard so that I would do well on the exam. For what reason did you study hard? So that I would do well on the exam, for this reason, okay? And the conditions would be the words if and unless. So that means you have to have a certain condition for something to happen. Let's read the first one. If your professor gives a list of class rules, notice the comma because we started with if, you must be sure to follow them. So this means that you must follow the rules only if your professor gives you a list of class rules. That's the condition. And then the second one, do not use a dictionary in class unless your professor allows you to do so. So if your professor allows you to do so, then you can, but do not. The condition is that you cannot use it. But if your professor tells you you can, then you can. That would have to be the condition. Do not use a dictionary in class unless your professor allows you to do so. Okay? That's the lesson. We're going to do some exercises. Remember that if you begin any sentence with one of these subordinators, which introduce the dependent part of the sentence, okay, the dependent clause of the sentence, you must have a comma separating the dependent part of the sentence from the independent part of the sentence, like we learned down here. The professor gave the class his email address so that students could send him their compositions. We did not begin with the dependent clause, so there's no comma. But if we say, so that students could send him their compositions, comma, the professor gave the class his email address. Okay, so remember that. We're going to turn the page. Okay, hold on one second. This is not allowing me to turn the page, so I'm going to stop the video here, and then I will make another one with the next page, okay? Rather than do this over again, so I'm going to stop the share, come right back for the exercises, okay?